Alrighty, YouTube says I'm live and I'm going to take their word for it instead of asking, hey, can anybody hear me? I'm back on a decent video feed now instead of having to fight with OBS to get it to come out right. It was my own fault. I didn't have my camera set up, but I'm just excited that a couple of people waited and hopefully I'll get to tell a story that people are interested in. I said I wanted to talk about the toughest people that I knew in prison. And I know that the mind is immediately going to go to the big guy. You know, the guy with the giant muscles that nobody wants to mess with. And there were a couple of those. Scooby had a friend who I wouldn't have wanted to cough in the wrong direction at because I think he could have snapped a man in half just like that. I actually mean tough as in, I'm going to talk about my wife because I was thinking today about how she took care of herself and my son that I couldn't take care of, and then my second son that I couldn't take care of. And she did it with very little help, and she never complained. In fact, if anything, she was there for me if I was having a bad day. Today we were talking about some of the stuff she endured. She mentioned having to carry things home because she's an epileptic and she can't drive a car. So she had to carry the food for the boys on her back. And she had to put the boys in a stroller, and then she had to cook for them and feed them and then clean up after them. I know this is a channel about prison and it's what I'm going to move on to talking about. But before I talk about big, tough, scary guys that I met in the pen, I had to point out that the toughest person that I can think of in the whole time that I was locked up, well, she took care of my boys when I couldn't. And boy, not being able to take care of the people you love, well, it hurts. Some people, well, they can use that pain as an incentive and they get tough in a different way. That guy I was talking about who could bump out 300 burpees with somebody else standing on his back. Not literally, of course, but some people built their life around the ability to do harm to one another. One of the, I'm going to say quickest and roughest fights that I saw, quickest and nastiest, whatever you want to say, was an elderly Asian gentleman, strangely enough, who had a cane. And he and I were friends. Not friends like close, but friends like, yeah, hey, what's up, man? This was SNY, and you were allowed to be friends with whoever you want. And he and I both played bridge. We never played together, but I mentioned a bridge term one time, and he knew what I was talking about. Well, somebody was rude to him. And there's a rubber stopper at the end of a cane. Real quick, the cane came up, and the guy's foot came down, knocked the rubber stopper off the cane, came down onto the instep of the man that it pushed against him a little bit. And this was a 25-year-old youngster. I don't know what his name was, but he was tough and jacked, and he'd pushed up on an old man a little bit. Not in a, I'm going to beat you up type of way, but they were occupying the same space, and he had assumed the old guy was going to get out of his way. As it turned out, it was a stomp on the instep and then a little jab with his cane. And it was over. As far as I know, there was no further confrontation between the two of them, but I didn't live in the building. I just knew the people there. For all I know, he killed him in his sleep a couple nights later. That's one kind of tough. And essentially what it is it's the ability to inflict harm or violence on somebody. There's also the tough, meaning you can do 100 burpees or whatnot. And I'll talk about a more muscular type of tough in a moment, but I want to look through my comments and just make sure I didn't miss anybody. John McHugh pointed out that a wife who holds down the family is really awesome, triple OG, and I agree wholeheartedly. My wife, how can I not? But anybody who looked after somebody whenever they were locked up, well, that's a real decent thing to do, especially if they deserved it. They can't take care of themselves. Of course, if you didn't want to focus on prisoners and instead you wanted to focus on somebody who was elderly or infirm who couldn't take care of themselves, that's awesome too. Your own children, anybody you can take care of that needs it. What happens to a 50-year-old white first-termer going in for 8 years from Irish coffee? insurance agent. And I can talk about kosher food in just one moment. Ein Harjar, I'm going to say. If you were going in just doing 8 years in CDCR, a white first termer, you're not going to hit one to start with, probably. And it's going to matter if you're a violent or non-violent offender as classified by the state. Some offenses you wouldn't think of as violent are listed as violent. And some are not violent whenever you would expect they might be. If you were a non-violent assault and the other guy got hurt, absolutely. You're going to go to a 2-yard. It's going to be dormitory living. In California, you're probably going to... You're going to see a lot of active gang members and stuff like that, but this is a 2-yard. So long as you don't walk around pushing on people, you don't do the things that you shouldn't do in prison. Owe money, that's from gambling or drugs, whatever. Even if it's, I'm going to have you send the money, put the money in the guy's hand. Don't owe him something. Don't get touched up in the gang and really decide you want to be the big bad guy. I don't think a 50-year-old insurance agent wanted to do that. And don't make the living area that you're in worse for dudes around you. Whatever that might mean. Some guys have poor hygiene. Some guys have a problem masturbating constantly. Some guys snore loud. If you can just cohabitate with the guys around you and you don't do the drugs or the gangs, you'll be all right, man. Like, really, it's not that scary of a place. And I don't even know what SNY and GP means nowadays because there's so many gang members on the SNY yards and there's frankly so many rats on the GP yards or have floated in that direction that I wouldn't even worry too much about the GP SNY thing. Just do your own time, mind your own business, watch your back, watch your mouth. No worries, man. It'll be all right. It's just a couple of years. And I know that sounds crazy, just a couple of years, but you got to wrap your head around it that way. I did get kosher food in prison, and it was actually a process to get it. I had a real complaint with the means by which I got kosher food. They didn't restrict it at the time, and now it's a lot easier to get. At the time, you had to really put effort into demonstrating a Jewish heritage. You had to attend a synagogue for a long time. There was a gentleman who was a Messianic Jew, and he was explicit about this. He said, I am a Christian. I believe in Christ, but I think I should get kosher food as part of my religion, which meets the court's standard, and this was appealed and other people won. But at the time in CDC, it was hard to get kosher food because it was expensive. And once I got it, it was much better quality because it all came from outside of the prison. There were some things that were frankly inedible, the same as there are in any meal system. Don't expect that I mean it was like going to a deli and getting decent food. This was all sent from an outside vendor, and it was sent to the lowest bidder, I'm sure. CDC reached a lot of people and said, hey, we need a bunch of kosher food. And they bought the cheapest stuff they could find. But it was prepared outside of a prison. And in the final analysis, I think a lot of people signed up on the kosher meal program just for that. Now anybody in CDC can sign up on the program with a little bit of effort, but it's fewer hot meals. You get a cold breakfast and a cold lunch. So very few people elect to stay on it long term, even though the food is by and large of a higher quality. I was talking about tough guys in prison, basically, and really anybody has a question in the comments, I don't mind answering them. But you meet the guys in there who, well, you don't even need to be tough. You don't need to be willing to hurt the next guy. You need to have that physical discipline to get big muscles and assert yourself. If you can be the biggest and loudest guy in the room, well, hell, that's scary all by itself, and it's a type of tough. Anybody who's tried bodybuilding, anybody who's tried to go out and do 100 burpees every day, heck, anybody who come New Year's said, I'm going to lose some weight this year, I promise, and then come next New Year's said it again, well, I think you can relate to the amount of physical and mental discipline that these guys that have 16-inch biceps put into it. Some do it for different reasons. Some do it simply to be safe. It's a way to be safe. If you're bigger than the next guy doesn't want to mess with you, he can avoid it. of course, that is a double-edged sword, because there is that joke about, you go into the prison yard and you take flight on the guy you can find. That's terrible advice. Don't do that. I don't know where that cliche came from. It's not a good plan. But it does make you a target. It does make you stand out if you're that guy, and you can end up in some difficulties from it. On the other hand, plenty of people do it not just to be safe, but as a matter of mental and physical discipline, and to keep the people around them safe. In an environment where it is a real possibility, 3 guys who have a problem with something that has nothing to do with you. You're the wrong gang member, the wrong color, you're in the wrong part of the prison even. It's a real possibility that 3 guys come running at you and your friend with weapons, intent to kill you for you don't know what or why. Well, if you and your friend have been training every day for that moment out there, doing them burpees and them weighted pull-ups and maybe shadowboxing a little in the cell, maybe you and your friend walk out of that alive. And as always is the case, whenever a group of people train to defend themselves, it's not just about personal safety. Me, Frank, Bob, and Jim aren't over there in the corner busting out burpees because I'm afraid and Frank is afraid and Bob's afraid. We're doing it as a group to protect each other. And an acquaintance of mine, a friend of mine even at High Desert, Derek, said one time whenever I said, a fight only lasts 5 minutes. What do you got to do 1,000 burpees for? You only need to have the wind for a 5-minute fight at most. He said, well, yeah, and you can have that logic, but if the riot kicks off and you and your cellie over there are trapped in the corner, even after I won my 5-minute fight, I'd like to have the wind to come get you guys. Well, I sure did lose that argument, and I went and did the extra 15 minutes worth of burpees with him and thanked him afterwards for pointing out how selfish my logic was. Pretty fly for a Wi-Fi. I tell you what, man, I don't have like a bunch of Wolfpack stories, but I'm not going to use the dude's name, but gosh, I got to come up with a fake name because he has the perfect Wolfpack name. Anyway, my acquaintance Cobra, he was a good dude. And he was one of the very few people at High Desert who got family visits, which was cool as hell for him because it was almost nobody at High Desert got family visits. But Cobra was a Wolfpack member. And the way he told it, this is such a great story, and I'm going to have to do a video on it, but I'll go ahead and give you the scoop now. But the way he told it is that he was back in Z Unit there at High Desert whenever they opened it. And he was only doing a little chunk back in Z Unit, and this was before his stuff dropped, and they decided to send him to B Yard because he didn't have a shoeable offense, even though he'd been back in the shoe, but that's the way that works. He hit the yard, and he got to know him, and he'd been there for a while, and he tells a story, and it's the funniest dang story I've ever heard, that he was back there in Z Unit, and was called up and told he was being validated as not a wolf pack, but a little subunit of the wolf pack. I don't know what the names of the subunits are, but he was being validated as a member of this group. He's already got the wolf pack tats. He's already from Sacramento. But he tells them, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of that group. And they go, well, you've got this tattoo on you, don't you? Yeah. And it's because him and a couple of his friends had matching tattoos from their little clique. And apparently him and his couple of friends are now being validated. And just because, even though he hasn't seen them in years, he's getting validated along with them. And he had to file an appeal on it, where just because they're now STG, a security threat group, the fact I knew them 2 years ago doesn't mean that I'm automatically a member of their security threat group. I don't even know what the name of this group is. They started it after he went to the shoe and whatnot. Cobra was a good dude because him and his cellie, Ray, were about as close as a pair of cellies can get. And they'd been cellies on another yard where for 2 years, and then they got separated, and now they were cellies again. And I remember talking to him one time, and he said, well, it's actually pretty easy. Anything that comes in the cell, we just toss it in the big bowl, and then we break that in half. And he really wasn't kidding around, I found out, because I got to help deliver trays and stuff on an occasion. And they literally, whenever their dinner came in, whenever we were on lockdown, I got to deliver some extra trays because I was a clerk, and so the cop said, "Here's some extra trays, give them to whoever needs them." Well, they literally took the food and put both of their salads in one bowl and all their beans and rice in another bowl, and then sealed it up and put it up, and I guess they just split it down the middle anytime they wanted something, and that's stinking beautiful. What years was I in Corcoran? I was in Sat F. Robin E. I do not know Robin E. I did know a couple of NLRs whenever I was there at Sat F. Did he have a handle? I was at Sat F, which is New Corcoran, from 2007 to 2013, I think. I need to actually break out the paperwork to be 100%, but that's right, because after that I went to Chino for 3 years, well, for 4 years, and then for Chowchilla for about a year, so yeah. I have had this live stream going for 16 minutes. I intend to continue going for another 9 minutes or so. I was shooting for a 25-minute live stream, but it occurs to me that I haven't announced in any manner when I would be planning on wrapping this up, and I certainly don't want to be abrupt at that time. You don't just meet guys that are really worried about being tough in the active yards. Guys that, 6'3" with 250 pounds of muscle. Plenty of dudes carry that right over to those S&Y yards whenever they go there, and there's plenty of guys that are pieces of garbage from day one who are straight jacked. Here's a real name. I'm going to toss out a real name. There's no handle here. It's Johnny Zenk, Z-E-N-C. I was at Sat F with him. Piece of garbage. I don't know him personally. We weren't cellies. I can't say he was a piece of garbage. But I can tell you that one of the reasons that lifers didn't get family visits for a long time was because the guy was accused of raping his mother and his sister. I'm supposed to watch. I don't care. Raping his mother and his sister while they were at a family visit. This is when he was incarcerated. I can say for a fact that happened because I was a clerk and actually saw paperwork saying that an investigation had been done and that it was determined there was no merit to the allegation. I do not know what evidence there was that made there be an investigation, but I do know he didn't get family visits after that, and that there was certainly something to it because there was a real investigation done. It wasn't just a offhanded thing. There was, of course, another case with somebody who was committing some type of EDD fraud, as I understand, and this was in a time whenever the political climate didn't lend itself to the rights of inmates, especially regarding conjugal visits or something like that. So it was many things, I'm sure, but he was famous on the yard. People would point him out. And the reason I'm mentioning him in this context is the dude was 50, and he was jacked at 50. I think the only conversation I had with him that was of any length, well, about a minute, was whenever I was in the canteen line with him one time, and he was asking for a critique on his physique. Semi-random stranger. I lived on the yard with him. He probably knew my name, but... And yes, the answer was yes, as a 50-year-old, your muscles are going to be getting saggy. He had one other interesting thing about him, and I think it was probably because he was not liked. There were a couple of inmates on this yard, Sat F.E. yard, that people just didn't like to deal with because they were known as kind of nasty people. I mentioned a guy named Coach who'd gotten the handle because he was supposed to have molested a team. And he played it up like he used the handle, and he'd say, well, yeah, that's why I got it, because he was, I guess, owning it. But what a piece of garbage, and people knew he was a piece of garbage, so the only people he could own it around was this little clique of pieces of garbage like Johnny Zink. The one other thing interesting about Johnny Zink was that he was the gopher whisperer. As in, he would go out onto the yard, and he spent years on this yard because it was the high-profile PC yard in Sat F at the time, and he would feed the gophers, and they got to know him. He'd crinkle his bag, and they'd come running out. More than one. There was at least 2 or 3 gophers that knew him, and one that I saw on more than one occasion riding on his shoulder like a stinking mouse. I guess whenever you just take it for granted that, human concept is no longer an option, you start looking for something else to make friends with. I hate to be so judgmental about somebody who possibly is even innocent of whatever he was accused of, but that yard at SADF, it was where they sent the people that couldn't program anywhere else. It was one step short of the PHU where they sent people like Sirhan, or Manson. Of course, these people were not of that caliber. But yeah, there were some real pieces of garbage that I got to meet there, and I guess shame on me for being there. Don't hear that I'm trying to play a holier than thou. I made my own choices to get there, and hey, it was a nice yard to be on. I got to be around my wife every stinking weekend because she lived there in Corcoran. That was the punchline of how tough she is and how much she endured. She actually had a pretty comfortable, safe, I can't say easy, who has an easy life, but comfortable probably. She left it to come live in Corcoran and be near me. While there, we got our family visits, that thing that Johnny Zink got taken from the lifers. And we conceived a child, my eldest. And a couple of years after that, we conceived another. We have 2 children. And the reason we have them is because she's so dang tough, tougher than Johnny Zank looking tough, tougher than that guy who could knock the stopper off his cane and put it in your throat in 3 seconds. Real scary tough. She's tough. Mama bear with her cubs. Tough. It's where I started, and it's where I wanted to wrap up today. Because I'd been thinking about it. And, all this talk about prison. I see... I guess I'm a prison YouTuber. I wanted to be judgmental about prison YouTubers, and there's only a couple that I feel are glorifying. Not many, because most people who've actually been there have no interest in glorifying anything like that. But I wanted to mention what I thought was tough, and it had nothing to do with a prison yard. I wanted to thank everybody who showed up, or anybody who happens to catch it in the reruns, I suppose what we'd call a live stream that you watch the next day. Thank you for listening. I mean that sincerely. I'm going to close now, and everybody have a nice day.